Cool that I'm preaching today because this is about as close of a Sunday as you can get to Kenzie and I's 4-year anniversary of being at Hope. We walked into this service, actually, the 9 a.m. service. It was the very first one. And we came in. At that time, the sanctuary all faced that way. You could only come in through that door. The service had already started, so we were walking in front of everyone. And if you know Kenzie, she was dying inside. Yeah. And we sat down with 2 children that weren't our own and sat through the first 9 a.m. service, which, it was the first one. It was a little rough. But somehow we stayed. And I just think that's really cool that I get to be up here on kind of the anniversary-ish of that. And actually, it was this 9 a.m. service that convinced me that I really wanted to be a part of this church, because I love that our church is one that encourages not just looking to Dan as the man with all the answers, but as saying we want to all be able to answer those questions for each other. We want to be a community that builds each other up. We want to be, every single one of us, a leader in the church in our own way, in our own right. And you don't see that as much as you should. So I just really like that. All right. Before we get into the actual passage, there's kind of some context I want to bring to this. So we're going to be in Matthew 9:18 through 26. And this is going to focus, there's kind of a nuance that I want you to notice through all of this. And some of you might be more familiar with it than others, but in Jewish culture, it was a big deal whether you were ceremonially clean or unclean, or whether an item was ceremonially clean or unclean. And for the Jews, it was imperative to stay clean in that sense as much as you could. So they would do anything they could to avoid being considered unclean. All right? And both instances that we're going to read about in today's passage, Jesus is going, I think, more countercultural than we can even realize in putting himself in these situations where he should be becoming unclean. It should be tainting him, essentially. And we're going to see things go a little bit differently when Jesus is involved, But the 2 instances we're going to talk about are actually 2 of the biggest kind of no-nos there were. One is dead bodies. In general, the Jews in this time, they would even take precautions, like an unmarked grave was a terrible thing to them because someone might walk over that unmarked grave, not realize it, have become unclean, and then take that uncleanness into the synagogue or temple. And that was a horrible idea to them. And so it was important to them to make sure that you knew where people were buried so that people could avoid walking anywhere near a dead body. Jesus is going to walk right up to one. The other one is that if a person had any kind of a bleeding condition, including like regularly, then they were considered... Stop laughing at me. I can see her laughing at me. Then they were considered unclean. And in fact, it even went on 7 days after the bleeding had stopped. So women were considered unclean 7 days after even they had that. And Jesus ignores that. And we'll see why as we go through it. But let's go ahead and get into the passage. I'm just going to read the whole thing, and then we'll kind of backtrack through it. It's just 8 verses, but like Alan and I were talking about before service, there's a lot packed into these 8 verses. All right, so starting in verse 18. As Jesus was saying this, suddenly an official came up and knelt down in front of him. "It's my daughter," he said. "She's just died, but if you'll come and lay your hands on her, she'll come back to life." Jesus got up and followed him. So did his disciples. Just then a woman appeared. She had suffered from internal bleeding for 12 years. She came up behind Jesus and touched the hem of his coat. "If I can only touch his coat," she said to herself, "I'll be rescued." Jesus turned around and saw her. "Cheer up, my daughter," he said. "Your faith has rescued you." And the woman was healed from that moment. Jesus went into the official's house. There he saw the flute players and everybody in a great state of agitation. "Go away," he said. "The little girl isn't dead. She's asleep." And they laughed at him. So when the crowd had been put out, he went in and took hold of her, and she got up. The report of this went out around the whole of that region. Apparently I can't read today. All right, so that's it. That's the whole passage. So it just starts off, this guy comes up to Jesus and is like, "My daughter is dead." Now, there's a little more detail given in some of the other Gospels, particularly Mark and Luke, add on to this. And he comes up at first and he says, "My daughter is very ill," and then later someone comes up and says she's died. But Matthew is very much into condensing these stories down, giving the bare bones details. He seems to be very motivated by recording what Jesus did and getting the message across. In particular, a lot of people believe Matthew was very focused on emphasizing Jesus' authority. He would have been writing to a mostly Jewish community. That was his kind of target audience. And so it was important for that community, for them to realize Jesus' authority, that he came with power and that his power was from God and that he was God. And the way to explain that to them was showing over and over all the instances where he conquered these things. I'm not going to have an opportunity to get into this particular part in today's service, but kind of an overarching thing that you see in Matthew is there's a statement where he'll say Jesus has power over this, this, and this, and then the stories that proceed directly after it will give examples of that. So this is mostly considered Jesus is the example of Jesus having power over death. That death doesn't hold a candle to him. And so that is just a very interesting thing. I would encourage you to look more into that for yourself, because if you've studied Bible Project at all, that sort of thing is fascinating, and it is all through Scripture, where there are all these nuances that tie the stories together. They are not meant to just be individual stories looked at one at a time. But we're going to look a little more in depth into this story in particular. So first off, this official that shows up, he wasn't just like a random guy. He wasn't a Gentile. He was a Jewish official. Most likely, his name was Jairus. I believe I said that right. I looked up the pronunciation, but now I have all the different ways I thought it should be said in my head. So if I say it 6 different ways, that's why. But Jairus was his name. We see that in Mark and Luke, and he was a synagogue official. So most likely he was, or what they know is that he was actually the owner of the synagogue. So he wasn't, and he was likely a member of the Sanhedrin. We don't know that for sure. But what we do know is he was running in very religious circles. Even if he wasn't necessarily a part of like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all that was going on with that. He was very much part of those circles, and he knew how they felt about Jesus. He knew exactly what they thought about what he was doing. Because by running up and talking to Jesus, not only that, but he kneels before Jesus. He runs up to Jesus and he kneels down. That's the first thing he does. There are several instances leading up to this in Matthew where he points out that people kneel before Jesus. This is the only time any kind of person with authority in the Jewish culture kneels before Jesus. There is not another instance in Matthew where a Jewish official of any type is willing to kneel before Jesus. And this man runs up to Jesus, immediately kneels down. He knows Jesus' authority. And he knows what he's doing by doing this in a public way, in a public place. He is letting everyone know, regardless of what they think, that he recognizes and respects Jesus' authority and power. And for him, that is the greatest gesture he can think of to make to Jesus. Because he's desperate. Because he was taking a huge risk. This could have, and for all we know it does, kind of ruin his life and his livelihood. He's not going to be looked at the same by all those Sadducees and Pharisees that come to his synagogue and worship. He's not going to be treated the same. He's not going to be liked by them. But he doesn't care. So he comes to Jesus and he is begging Jesus to heal his daughter. And Jesus immediately, like I said, Matthew doesn't go into the kind of the fanfare as much, the details, but immediately Jesus is going with him to heal this man's daughter. Jesus saw what this man was doing, that he was willing to throw it all away for Jesus. And then on the way, we see another approach to Jesus. And it's interesting how different and yet equally, if not more so, respectful this approach was. We see this woman that was suffering from bleeding, which Jesus actually, that term, Kinsey and I were talking about this when we were writing it. It's not a very great way to refer to her. Like, that's not who she is. Like, that was the whole problem, is that her entire society, all they saw when they saw her was her condition. All they saw was her uncleanness. And so I'm going to try. I might not succeed because it's kind of ingrained in there, but I'm going to try to refer to her for the rest of this the same way Jesus did, which was as a daughter. She is actually the only instance, and it's kind of cool how many times in this passage, in this little passage, I am going to say this is the only time Jesus does this. But she's the only person we have recorded Jesus calling daughter in Matthew. So he was redefining her. He was saying, he was saying, and I'm getting ahead of myself, I realize that, but he was saying you are no longer defined by your condition. You're defined by how I see you. And I see you as a daughter of the kingdom. So when she approaches him, though, there's this fear. She doesn't even want him to know that she's going to touch him, because she doesn't want him to know that she might be making him unclean. She doesn't want to trouble him or bother him. And if you think about it, this woman, we see more in detail what she's been dealing with in Mark and Luke. She has had this condition for 12 years. She has been unclean for 12 years. What that means in that society, people didn't touch her unless they had to. People really wouldn't have even interacted with her unless they had to. She was ostracized from her community. If she was married, her husband would have slept in a different bed than her, keeping himself separate so he could remain clean. This woman had probably not had a genuine, any kind of like affection shown to her in 12 years. I don't know about you, but that would mess me up. I wouldn't think much of myself after 12 years of that. They say that like the average adult needs like 3 hugs a day or something like that to maintain good mental stability. On Facebook. Exactly. If it's there, it's true. That's why I said they say. I didn't say it was true. No one knows how many Alan needs. All right. All right, let's rewind. Anyway, the point is, that was not happening. She was in this place where her life kind of sucked. But she also takes a risk, because if she gets found out, the punishment for intentionally breaking the commandments involving uncleanness was severe. In Leviticus, it details it out. And so she was taking this huge risk that she would be more mistreated and isolated than she already was, more looked down upon. And yet she, the same as Jairus, is willing to risk it all, is willing to, for just a touch. She believes in Jesus' power so much that she is like, if I can just have a touch. Now, was there a superstitious mindset to that? Perhaps, but ultimately Jesus didn't care if her faith wasn't perfect. He cared that she had faith. He cared that she had the faith to take action and pursue him, even if her pursuit wasn't perfect. Because ultimately, even lepers had more courage when they approached Jesus than she did. They would come to him face to face because they at least had a community. She didn't have that. She was looked down on by everyone, and so she snuck behind him and tried to just touch just a little corner of what was likely his prayer shawl, which would have been the very reminder of all those laws. Those prayer shawls, even the 4 tassels, they have specific knots in them to remind them of, I think it's 613 laws that the main ones that they want to remember and obey. That's a lot. And so she was touching the very reminder of those things. But Jesus turns around, and it doesn't go anything like what she expected, or what I would presume she expects. I guess I don't know what she expected. But he turns around, and instead of being like everyone else and being like, "You're unclean, get away from me," he immediately turns to her and says, and I want to read this. He says to her, "Cheer up, my daughter. Your faith has rescued you." I don't think that's what she was expecting. And that word rescued, other translations say it as whole, And it's this idea of not just being healed, but she was made whole in mind and soul and body. Because when Jesus heals, the outward exterior healing that we all see and we all label things with and we all talk about is the least important part of the healing. Jesus makes a point of saying that in several other miracles, that the important part is what he heals on the inside. Because that, I'm getting ahead of myself again, and I know, but I'm excited and I can't help it. When he touches you, he doesn't get unclean. He makes you clean. He made her clean. When she touched him, he had no fear of her uncleanness because his touch made her clean. Thank you. And so then we move on from also, and Thad, I did skip ahead and watch that scene in The Chosen. I'm sorry. He told me not to, but I couldn't help it. If you watch that scene breaks your heart to watch. This woman, they do an excellent job of portraying just how fearful she would have been and how gentle Jesus is with her. This is one of the most gentle ways we see Jesus interacting with someone, is he calls her daughter. He makes sure she knows that he sees her as a daughter. He sees her as valuable. He sees her as worthy of affection and care. And so then we move on from this and we go to Jairus' house. And he gets there and there's all this noise and these mourners, because in this time you hired mourners. So these weren't people that actually cared. They were paid to wail and play flutes. And apparently I read something that was talking like it's discordant music. So it didn't sound good. It was literally just people blowing into instruments to make it sound as awful as possible. I guess the idea is that if the family's miserable, everyone around should be miserable. That's what it sounds like. But Jesus gets in there, and he immediately throws them out, and he tells them she's only sleeping. They laugh at her. If you really weren't sure if they cared or not, that kind of shows they didn't care, because they just started laughing as soon as he was like, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. They ridiculed him, they laughed at him. He doesn't care about that. He throws them out of the house. And he goes to this girl. Once again, he grabs this girl's hand, making himself unclean according to the Jews. And yet she wakes up. She's no longer dead or asleep as he saw it. She is awake and alive and no longer unclean. She is clean, because when Jesus comes into contact with a person, a situation, whatever it is, that is made clean. Nothing can make Jesus unclean. So he has no fear of our uncleanness or of anyone's uncleanness. He just has a desire for us to seek him out so that he can make us clean. He wants us to be willing to risk it all. These people both were willing to risk it all for Jesus. So, ultimately that makes me turn around and ask myself, what am I willing to risk? Am I willing to risk it all? Am I willing for everyone around me to look at me like I'm stupid or wrong or evil in order to follow Christ? Because I cannot be afraid of what people consider unclean. Because I am focused on the one who cleanses. I am pursuing him. And I know I'm unclean. And he knows I'm unclean. But it's important we ask ourselves, what is it that we need cleansed? Both of these people knew exactly what it was. Jesus wasn't doing this for the daughter. The daughter had no idea what was going on. He was doing it for the faith of the father. And the father knew exactly what was unclean in his house. And he desired for it to be made clean, to be made whole, to be restored. And the woman, she knew exactly what it was. That word, actually, the Greek word is sozo. That means that idea of clean, that idea of wholeness. The Greek word is sozo. And it, like I said, it's that idea of just completely whole. And that is what Christ does to us, is he makes us completely whole. So what does sozo look like? Does it look like stress and anxiety? Does it look like just a slog making it through the day? Does it look like being focused on all the things that are wrong in life? I don't think it does. I don't think a lot of times that I am allowing that sozo to be in my life. God wants it to be there. He's happy to bring it about. But I'm messing it up almost as fast as he's willing to heal it in me. And so I need to be more focused on that, more focused on him, focused on letting him cleanse me, focused on letting him be a part of my life. I want to be the one kneeling down before him saying, help me. I want to be the one that is so desperate to be near him that I will push my way through a crowd, break all the rules in order to just touch him. That's the person I want to be. I don't think I am that person yet, but that's who I want to be. That's what I hope to see grow from this church is that we become the people that are desperate for sozo. We are desperate for the wholeness that only God can bring. And so I just got to ask, am I willing to risk it for it? And if I'm not, I got to figure out how to be. Because that's what I want, and that's the only way I'm going to truly appreciate what Christ has given us, is if we're willing to risk it all for him. Let's go ahead.